We've looked at all the parts of the cranium, or the skull, and the different bones that make it up. The facial skeleton is made up of numerous irregular shaped bones. The first one we're going to talk about is the maxillary, and there's two of these. It's this yellow bone, which is the maxilla, one on each side of the face. It comprises your upper jaw, which also makes the roof of your mouth, and it will be part of the floors of your orbits or eye sockets. It also makes up your the sides of your nasal cavity and the floors of your nasal cavity. So if you're looking at your when you're looking at sinuses and things like that in your nasal cavity, so that maxilla is going to make up the sides and floors of that cavity. So there's the sinuses, the different sinuses that you have in your head. You have the frontal, the maxillary or maxilla right behind there, sphenoid and ethmoid. Sticking with the facial skeleton, you have your palatine. There's two of them. This is right behind the maxilla. It's kind of an L. One of them is an L-shaped, and then they come together. It's your palate, which is the palate in the top part of your mouth. This is going to be the posterior or back section of that hard palate. It also makes up the floors of the nasal cavity, and those lateral walls are the outside walls of the nasal cavity. And then you have your zygomatic bone, which are the prominences of your cheek. This yellow bone, or I'm sorry, this green bone right here is your zygomatic. So that's what gives you the prominences of your cheek. It also makes up the lateral walls of your orbits, so your outside walls, and then goes under to make the floor of your orbits. Now, lacrimal is very close to your ethmoid bone, but it's that blue one right there, and it's going to be the medial wall of your orbits, and it makes up that groove from the orbit to this nasal, the nasal cavity. Speaking of nasal, this is your nasal bone, which is the bridge of your bone, or I'm sorry, the bridge of your nose. And the last one is volmer. So this is right here, this pink. It is going to make up your inferior portion of your nasal septum. That's right there in the middle of your, goes down the medial line of your face. And then the last bone we're going to talk about for your facial skeleton is the mandible. And this is just one bone. It makes up your lower jaw. You have the two foramens in the mandible. The one is the mandibular foramen, and then you have the mental, which is right here on your jawline, that allows those blood vessels and nerves and things to go through. Alright, so that's the facial skeleton. We're going to move into the vertebral column and the thoracic cage. The vertebral column is made up of three different portions of your vertebrae, and then a sacrum and a coccyx. Your cervical vertebrae are the first 7 vertebrae, and your thoracic are the next 12 vertebrae, and lumbar are the 5. You often hear these referred to, especially if you're talking about injuries, they may say a C1 or a C2. They just number these, so cervical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if it's a C1 injury, it's very high up on your spinal cord, which probably, if there was a lot of damage to a C1 or a C2, you'd be a quadriplegic because it damages all the nerves from there. So wherever that's at, like a T1 would be up top, a little bit lower down but higher in the thoracic, and then the lumbar would be down here. Each portion of the vertebral column has a certain curvature. Those curvatures are there to be able to withstand more pressure and take off the pressure for being able to stand upright. In between each of these vertebral in between each vertebrae are called intervertebral discs. We talked about these when we talked about the tissues. Those are the discs that are made up of that vertebral cartilage. And these are the ones that if you have a slip disc, it would indicate that it would move out between the vertebral column in between when it's supposed to be between those vertebrae. Alright, and then the sacrum, these are just 5 fused vertebrae in a triangle shape. And then the coccyx is your tailbone, and this is 4 smaller fused vertebrae at the very bottom of the vertebral column. Now attached to the vertebral column is your thoracic cage. Your thoracic cage includes ribs, all of your ribs, you have 12, your sternum, your thoracic vertebrae, that's what it's attached to, and that's why you have 12 thoracic vertebrae and you have 12 ribs, because those ribs are attached to the thoracic vertebrae. Now costal cartilages is the cartilage right here that's going to attach your ribs to your sternum, and its job is to support your shoulder girdle and upper limbs. It's also going to protect this viscera that's in here, the lungs and the heart and things. And it also takes place, has a role in breathing. So when we're looking at the ribs, you have what are called true and false ribs. The first 7 are going to be called true ribs because you can see these costal cartilages. The hyaline cartilage that makes up the costal cartilage is attached directly to the sternum. So the first 7 are called true ribs because the rib, and then there's the cartilage, and it attaches directly to the sternum. Now, the last 5 are going to be called false ribs because these ribs, you can see how the cartilage is attaching to the cartilage above it, and then they all attach to the sternum. Now, the last 2 false ribs are called floating ribs, and they are still false ribs, but they do not have any costal cartilage at all, so they're called floating ribs. When you look at the rib, a rib is considered a flat bone. It's not considered a long bone, just because of the structure. On a rib, you have the shaft that is right here. Now the head, on the posterior end, it's going to articulate or connect with the vertebrae. And then you have a tubercle, which articulates also with the vertebrae. And then, like we talked about, the costal cartilage. The costal cartilage is a type of hyaline cartilage. It just connects those ribs to the sternum. And then the sternum has 3 different sections. You have the manubrium, which is up top. And then this middle part right here is called the body. And then the very last that has the apex there is going to be called the xiphoid process.